Could I welcome you and most sincerely thank you for your attendance today. My name is Michael Howe. I'm the President of RUSI New South Wales, and on behalf of the Board we'd like to particularly welcome you. Thank you for your support. I'd like to particularly acknowledge our First Nations people, and in particular I'd like to acknowledge those First Nations people who have served, are serving or are contemplating serving in the ADF. Would you see the summary there of the distinguished career over 35 years that the General has had? And my final advice is never argue with him because he's a barrister and a KC. So if that is also a reasonable introduction, sir, thank you very much for your willingness to speak. For everyone, our Speaker, Major General Laidlaw. Thank you.
Well, President, senior officers, and I spy Generals Irving and Brereton, I think, sir, in the audience, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Look, it is indeed a privilege to be with you today and to, I suppose, at least give you something of the framework around the approach to what is, I think, a significant and momentous task in terms of a strategic review of the reserves. But to situate that, I would like to give you some flesh around the bones of the various structures and the pieces of the enterprise that are connected to that, and these are the pieces that are particularly within my division. So today I will certainly touch on the DSR and some aspects of that, but I'd also like to talk to you about the Defence Employer Partnering Network. I'd like to talk to you about some of the other work that the ADF Reserve and Employer Support Directorate are doing, and some of our other complementary tasks, such as a review of the system of protection of reserve service, and recent reforms of the employer support payment scheme. So I'm the head of Joint Support Services, which is a division that recently had a lift and shift from Joint Capability Group, and now find ourselves in the super group of Defence People Group. We're part of the Military Personnel Organisation, with the newly appointed Lieutenant General Natasha Fox, former Deputy Chief of Army, who is now the inaugural Chief of Personnel. And this part of the Defence People Group is the part that looks after the uniform component of Defence in particular. Now, having said that, my directorate, my division, which currently has some 10 directorates to it and about to extend out to potentially 14, is a fairly eclectic division. Its heritage is that it was born out of Reserve and Youth Division, and before that Cres D, very much with a Reserve and Cadets focus. But since 2017-ish and onwards, parts have been steadily bolted on to that, so that I now am also responsible for the Joint Military Police. I'm responsible for the Military Legal Service, so that's all the lawyers in uniform. And this is across the whole ADF. It's not just Reserve, it's the whole lot. Gender, Peace and Security, I have a directorate that is responsible for execution of that plan. Together with the more traditional reserve components and the youth-related stuff, which starts with the cadets, but also has a generalised youth directorate and our youth protection and insurance. And the cadets is a significant piece, and not to take away at all from the service chiefs who own their three respective cadet organisations. But with nearly 30,000 cadets in the country and nearly 5,000 or so adult volunteers, that is a significant amount of work trying to coordinate that and have the outcomes in what we've coined the one cadet sense, so where those three organisations should have common policy, that remit lies with us. So ADF Reserve and Employer Support, the directorate that has the most to do with reserves in my team, they have expanded their remit following the 2019 changes for the DRSC, Defence Reserve Support Council, that many of you may have been familiar with. So the whole employer award scheme and many of those schemes are now handled directly by my team within my division. So the Employer Support Awards, the Prince of Wales Awards, the direct engagement opportunities, the international engagement stuff that we do, and in particular there, Australia is a permanently invited guest to a number of NATO committees, which I attend as the head of delegation around reserve forces. We also run the Joint Reserve Working Group, and that I see as having a pivotal role in assisting the review team to the outcomes for the Strategic Review and Reserve, and a combined Joint Reserve Working Group where we get together with our colleagues in New Zealand, and of course the Employer Support Payment Scheme and the Reserve Service Protection. So it's a very busy directorate that has me bouncing around the country, engaging with lots of our reserve community, with lots of our employers, and from time to time with our partner nations to understand the issues commonly being faced by us in terms of reimagining, reconfiguring our reserve component and what that brings, in our case, to the concept of national defence. I touched on the Defence Employer Network. That body of, or that panel of people are appointed as advisors to CDF. They are drawn from significant Australians in industry in order to provide another perspective to defence. One of the limitations that I felt when I got into the job was that the makeup of the panel, which had never been fully fleshed out to its 9 members plus my role as the ex officio member, wasn't truly reflective of what I believed our reserve demographic to be. And we've done as best we can with the modelling using different sources of data to try and validate this. But if you think of the reserve component, and bearing in mind that there are significant differences in the pattern here between the three services, and so I think fairly, I'd have to concede I'm probably mostly talking about Army here, but if you think of the reserve demographic as a layered cake, my view is that somewhere between 30 or more % of that cake are people that are reservists but also work in another government agency of some sort or description. And that makes sense because often there's a permissive environment for that that supports that service. And then within even that 30 or 35%, a great proportion of those are in analogous jobs, uniform type jobs in emergency services. So your police, your fireys, your ambos. So that's a significant thing that has a lot of follow-on consequences for us as we get down the talk a little bit later. The next slice of the cake, if I was to take the middle piece, I think the middle piece of nearly a third are people that are other than traditionally employed. So within that slice, I would see your uni students, your unemployed, your part-timers, of which there is an increasing amount, your gig employees and your self-employed. So they're an eclectic bunch that I would describe as other than traditionally employed. And the last layer of the cake, the last third or less, are those people who are in traditional employment, but out of that, only a sliver on the top, in reality, work for big business. So a great proportion of that top third probably work for small to medium sized businesses, the sort of things that exist all around the country and all the towns from which we draw our reserve community. Now, the DEPN, the Defence Employer Partnering Network, when it was first recruited to, Defence used a recruiting agency to go out and find these people. This time round, I wanted a more targeted approach. So what we have just landed, and only yesterday had our first meeting with the new panel. We knew the sort of people that we wanted to get after, the sort of people that were deputy commissioners or emergency service commissioners, commissioners of police or fire services, those sort of people to represent and speak to the issues that arise out of a shared workforce in those sort of agencies. We needed some way to link in with smaller business, and we needed some way to link in better with academia, and we needed some way to link into defence industry, which is not so significant perhaps for the reserve in the army context, but certainly is for Navy and Air Force. Being more technical in nature, you tend to see quite a lot of overlap. The CERCAT 7s, the permanent force members, transitioning out into defence industry and then filling their life with a bit of reserve work on top. That seems to be a fairly well-trod path. So we now have a panel that much more closely reflects those industry segments. And from our first meeting with them yesterday, they are an enthusiastic bunch of people who I have given them the challenge that they, as many of us in the moment, where we're about to embark on doing everything we can to assist the strategic review into the reserves. And they will certainly have a role to play from the employer input side of it, and will be given specific questions and topics to advise on, which I would envisage will inform us to a large extent. So next, if I can touch then on the DSR itself. So there's a public version of the Defence Strategic Review that was handed down earlier this year, April, and within that it's stated that there is to be this strategic review of Defence Reserves, that it's to consider reserves and reserve service, so that's the pattern of service as much as the people themselves, as part of national defence, and that's a term I'll come back to in a moment, in the light of current strategic circumstances. And any reader of the papers will know the sort of risks and concerns we have in the world at the moment as a deteriorating security environment overall, and certainly it wouldn't be lost on you that one of the driving forces behind the DSR itself is the loss of the 10-year strategic warning that has featured so heavily in our thinking up until this point, and the loss of that is something that needs us, or causes us to reconsider so much of our posture. So in the light of those circumstances, it's to investigate innovative ways to adapt the current structure, shape, conditions of service, and the role of the reserves. It's to determine how the reserve, Defence Reserve complements the total defence workforce and can provide an expansion base and follow-on forces in time of crisis. Now, the TORs are presently with government, and I expect will be released soon. So I'm not in a position to make any announcements today. But you can draw out of what I've read to you, and I can tell you that the TORs don't shackle or put bumper bars around those words in any way whatsoever. So coming back to some of those words, national defence National defence is a concept linked, if you like, to the analogous of mobilisation itself. So mobilisation is not a defence-specific activity. Mobilisation is a whole of nation activity that has to involve all the components of our society. It might be led by defence, might be planned significantly in particular components by defence, but national defence is a concept which involves the whole of the nation. The reason why I think that is a significant concept within what it is that this reserve review is told to do links back to that issue that I talked about with the demographic of the reserve force. And the problem set that I can imagine that will have to be addressed includes, and I'll pause to tell you a bit of a story, try and make it a little bit more interesting. I recall as being in 4 Brigade in Victoria and running an exercise that was linked up with some work out of Jock that involved the Victoria Police and a role in a security type role for the reserves. I had the then Chief of Army, General Burr, come and visit, and we were down at a place in Gippsland. He came down and I was taking him around and introducing him to many of my infantry sections. And after the first couple, where it was obvious that although we're working green and blue side by side in a combined activity, within my team, within my infantry sections, no less than 2 or 3 of those soldiers in green, when asked what they do for a civvy job, were putting their hand up and say, but I'm also a Victorian police officer. And I could see the blood starting to drain out of his face a little bit as he realised, and then he started out, how many coppers have got here, how many fireys, as we went around. And I knew after not too long a time that he was starting to get very concerned by this. And I did say to him, look sir, I think that it isn't something to worry about at the moment. I think if we know what it is, it's certainly in the peacetime paradigm when we're training and preparing, it's incredibly useful, particularly if you're looking at the sort of operations that are going to link up with a civilian police force. And, you know, for our reserves, particularly those in the Army and the 2nd Division, where they now have primacy of operations in the domestic theatre, the ability to be able to, you know, speak soldier and speak copper and translate between the two and help those entities come together and work out how to do their techniques and procedures is really, really valuable. But there's a rub, obviously, and the rub is what was worrying Chief of Army. The rub is, what do you do on the day when you need to mobilise your reserve forces and at the very same time, those same individuals are counted within critical capabilities that otherwise support our civil society.
They're reserve occupations in many cases.
Well, this is the thing. We have a very strong piece of legislation, the Protection Act, which is the trump card that we can play every time. And I'll give you another example to come to that in a moment. But the reality is, if we're called to reconsider, redesign the reserve in its contribution to national defence, it is going to have to cope with the fact that you can't denude necessarily civil society of critical capabilities. Now, another example of that came up with a different capability is the medics and the health professionals during COVID. Right now, Defence contributed a lot of its capability towards that task force, and you know that's fine. I'm not here to criticise that, but that issue will arise again if we were in a time of having moved through crisis and into conflict on that sort of spectrum of warfare, and if the need has to be there to support operations, but we are drawing out of the community the very same people that the community relies on every day of the week, how's that going to work? And I think that one of the complex questions that the Reserve Review is going to have to grapple with will in fact be around trying to find an agile system and a system that is actually going to address that issue. Now, the issue around Reserve Service Protection Act, at the moment, within that Act, which General Greg Gard out of Victoria had, a Supreme Court judge, he had a lot to do with the writing of it. When I rub shoulders with NATO partners, that Act, when I tell them what's in it, it's pretty obvious that we've probably got one of the strongest pieces of legislation in the world. Having said that, and the headline point out of the Act is that it is a criminal offence for an employer to interfere with or to prejudice a reservist in any way in relation to their reserve service. It doesn't even have to be call-out. Only has to be, it could be a training exercise, it could be some other deployment, it doesn't have to be call-out. There is provision in it for CDF to require parties who are arguing over or can't resolve whether the employee be released to go to a compulsory type mediation, and clearly there's provisions in it for prosecution of those offences. But those mechanisms have never ever been used. What tends to happen is that we mostly resolve things by negotiation, which is what you'd want. Occasionally they get elevated up to my team, starting at 1800 Defence and bubbling up all the way to my team in Canberra, and then what they can't resolve then makes its way to my desk to engage directly. Out of some 22 complaints that came to the national level in the sort of first half of this calendar year, all but 2 came from other government agencies. So 2 from private industry, 20 from government. So my concerns around an issue that I think we have to address, I think are validated by all of these other little indicators that point to, there is a bit of a rub there. And even though we've got a terrific thing in the current words of the Protection Act, how does that work if we're not able to reach agreement with a hospital that has someone that needs to be in an ICU or something? I mean, we're not really going to see a prosecution of another government body like that over an issue like this. So to a certain extent, I think we need a different process that's going to allow us to resolve those issues. And if you bring all of that back to the concept of moving through, as I said, competition, crisis into conflict, in defence we would call the mobilisation and scalability at different points in time as you move through the requirement to be prepared at various levels. I can only envisage there's going to be more of that rather than less of it. In some ways, it will be dust off the books and the plans right back to World War II, where critical industries and things that were needed to support Australia ongoing and through the war were grappled with in that time frame. But nevertheless, the problem set does present itself. So the TORs, as I indicated, are reflective of that paragraph I read out. I've touched on why I think as part of national defence is important, because I think it's we can't just build a reserve force, the one that we would want on the day, and to hell with everything else. I think it's got to be in the context of everything else and work with everything else. But when we look at the other words that tell us what to get after, to adapt the structure and shape of the reserve forces. Right, that's pretty far-fetched, or far-reaching in terms of its what that's getting after. And I'll pause there to touch on international example. So our structure and shape of the reserve forces that we have at the moment, in the context of Navy and Air Force, it's very much reservists that were almost exclusively former permanent force members, transitioned out of full-time service in a technical sort of category, so effectively semi-retired, either pick up a job with defence industry, or they move from Air Force to to Boeing or Qantas and do something over there in the same sort of way they did, but might come back and do some work part-time. Okay, the Army. Sorry, to finish that off, in Navy and Air Force, the reservists are largely fitting into the back of the full-time organisations per se. Army's a little different. We have certainly some of that, but obviously in Army we also have reserve formations and units, which are all, every single one of them, a hybrid of full-time and part-time, but they're in a reserve division, and we have other reservists and reserve units that exist embedded in full-time higher organisations, in the logistics space, in the special forces space, and so on. The Army context of our reserve forces are what I would call an operational reserve. That is, there's a range of operational potential tasks for the ADF, and our reserve forces, if not already embedded into the permanent forces, are there to augment or follow on in exactly the same manner. It's just they need a longer time run up to get their training done to get to an operational level of capability. But other countries around the world, and including peer nations, have a different type of reserve. Right? So you might have a reserve, say, in the Navy context, that might be more akin to an auxiliary, where you are very closely linked to your merchant marine and you have a capability that you can draw on. Or it might be you have a strategic reserve in terms of a very large pool of people held at a lower level of training that you can draw on in extremis if you need them. The Americans rejected that model probably about 10 or 15 years ago, and so the US Army Reserve very much is back in that operational sort of thing, but they create niche capabilities for their Army reservists. Bear in mind the US as a model has not only the Army Reserve, there's the reserves that are the National Guard and the Home Guard and all these other bits and pieces, and the Naval Reserve. But in the Army context, more than 200,000 reservists providing the more niche capabilities. So it's the psychologists, the doctors, the lawyers, the dog handlers, a whole bunch of niche capabilities for which their army has sometimes between 50 and 80% of their capacity in those discrete areas is being provided by reservists. What that means for the US Army Reserve is that some components of their reserve force are almost always on operations. So I pause just to say structure and shape. There's not one single answer to this. There are many models around the world. There are models that start with conscription and then morph into reserves. There are some that link reserve service very strongly with educational opportunities. There's all sorts of models. The next thing that's on the list is the conditions of service piece. And clearly that is a understanding what the triggers and motivations are for service are going to be highly relevant to, building something, particularly if we're going to look at building something new. And I'm not forecasting anything, I don't know what the result will be, but certainly understanding what motivates and what's likely to motivate the right demographic, it clearly is a question that needs to be asked in order to work out, well, what are the supporting mechanisms that are going to make that happen, and fundamentally, what's the cost of that, and is that a cost that government can bear in order to achieve a recommended level of outcome. The role of reserves was also on the list. So that brings us back to, this dichotomy between, for example, a strategic reserve that you break in terms of, in times of war, and like break glass in times of war, I'm trying to say, as opposed to, an operational reserve held just off operational level of capability and able to deploy in a very short time. Or is it that we need both? Do we need to have both roles in order to do what it says, can provide an expansion base and follow-on forces in times of crisis? The expansion base and options for scalability, I think, will be particularly challenging for us to understand and get after in the Air Force and Navy space. As I said, their system really predicated on a particular model. And I don't know that allows them to have a demographic that they can draw on as scalable options are required as we move through that sliding scale, if we're ever required to move through crisis into conflict. So I'll pause there to say that the TORs, I think, fairly reflect those sorts of far-reaching questions. It appears to me that it will be really important for the review to have a good logic framework behind the questions that it's going to ask itself in order to get to the answers that are of the topics required. And I think at a point it sort of starts at the end, where what does it look like if Australia goes to war? What are the likely scenarios? Where is it that there might be gaps in terms of what our extant forces are capable of? And is there a role for a reserve component in filling that capability gap at that point in time? And if the answer to that is yes, then it's a comparison of, well, do what we presently have, does that cut the mustard, or do we need something else? And if we need something else, how do we slide back to today to put in place the plans and the programs to assure that at the point in time when we need it, we have what we need. So I think it'll be really important to get the right logic framework around that. Some other bits of work that are going on that have touch points into that. So one of the things that I'm trying to instigate is some more definitive human resources data around understanding the layers in our cake. So we have a human resources software system, and I'm pushing really, really hard to get some changes made, even though that software system is on the way out, and so it's hard to get modifications done now. But we need some definitive answers to those sorts of questions no later than the new year. And the reason I say that is that the DSR calls on this review to be completed by 2025. If that's going to happen, presumably it'll be needed in time for the budget of that year. If you work back from that, the government will need to have options ready to cost sometime deep into next year. And in order to hand it over with a nice bow around it, that will have gone through the highest committees in Defence probably around the middle of the year. So I expect that by the time we cross the start line, it's going to be a pretty rapid race to get that work done and get it submitted to government. So other pieces that are going on that are in support of that. Within Defence generally, there's a recruiting and retention Tiger team, which is seeking to address our recruiting and retention issues. One of the outcomes of the Joint Reserve Working Group was a decision that we would ourselves sponsor some work to obtain some evidence-based analysis around those motivations for service in the pay and conditions space. So this month we've been running a series of focus groups around the country, and we had more than 700 reservists volunteer to come and be part of those focus groups, and we're seeking to have a broad range of demographics covered in trying to understand issues of pay and conditions and how they relate to motivations for service. The Defence Reserve Service Protection Act that I talked about, we've instigated a review of that, and the direction I've given is that it's not really just the words in the legislation that I'm wanting looked at, it's the system. All right? It's everything from how have we communicated this, because it might be the words are fine, but just no one knows about it. You know, employers, you know, if they ever get rung up and told, look, you know, we might have to send an investigator around because it appears you may have committed an offence, and it's news to them. Whereas, you know, in other countries, it's right there front of mind, particularly in the US. So maybe it's our communications have been lacking. Maybe it's the resources behind it. Who knows? But nevertheless, we'll have a look at that. And maybe it's, you know, in addition to what we need, thinking of that national defence bit and the competing priorities for critical capabilities, whether we need some other really, really agile, non-litigious process to sort out between, you know, Army and Border Command, you know, where is a person going to go tomorrow, how are we going to do that. I mentioned before the piece around the HR software, so that's all going. And we've also recently undertaken some work to simplify the employer support payment scheme. That scheme supports employers of our reservists. It got a lot of use during the call out for the 1920 bushfire assist, got a lot of use for the COVID task force. What we need to do is, and what we have done, is abolish the 2-week qualifying period, because invariably every time we use our reservists heavily for this, that's the first thing we do, so we've just got rid of it altogether. And in order to balance making it more generally available, we've put some reasonable limits on how much of that, like 10 weeks sort of thing. There's carve-outs for exceptional cases and call-out type arrangements. And otherwise, we've been pretty keen to simplify the policy issues. So if I can wrap up the formal part of what I wanted to come and say today, is that you can be satisfied that the DSR has tasked, and my understanding of how that task has been received and been got after, is that there will be a very comprehensive and far-reaching strategic review of defence reserves in Australia, and the people in the reserve community that are beating down my door to come and contribute to that is truly impressive. You know, people with PhDs and all sorts of things, and decades of experience as career reservists, very much looking for a chance to contribute and get amongst it, as you would hope, and I think that gives me great confidence that as a community within Defence, the reserves certainly will have a chance to be heard in this. We've had similar engagements with the DRA, and we expect to continue those dialogue. And I think I'll leave it there.
Let me just thank you for your presentation, General. The Defence Strategic Review has certainly challenged us to seriously rethink how we structure, shape and employ the reserve component of the ADF. As the DSR has signalled, and as the General has so clearly articulated today, it's abundantly clear that for Australia to meet the significant strategic challenges of our times, that our reserve forces must be structured in such a way so as not just to complement the total defence workforce, but also to enable it to provide the expansion base for the ADF in times of crisis. For many in this room, that may not be such a surprising conclusion. Compulsory mobilisation of Reserve and National Guard forces, as you alluded to, has come to be fairly routine in America's recent wars. And it's sobering to recall that the United States deployed just over 750,000 troops to Afghanistan, and around 45% were from the National Guard and the Reserves. Incidentally, 12% of all UK personnel in the warfighting phase of the war in Iraq were reservists, and almost 50% of all positions in their field hospitals in Iraq were filled by reservists. I think it's fair to observe that in Australia, our part-time forces have often struggled to find a clear and useful role, whether in war or peace. However, despite the challenge of juggling civilian employment with reserve commitments, it's also fair to observe that most reservists appear to welcome a greater rather than a token obligation to serve. We certainly welcome the review. It is needed, it is timely, some might say it is overdue. But none here underestimate the task that lies ahead. So, General, thank you again for your thoughtful insights on where the review might take us. And can I assure you that the RUSI will endeavour to support you fully in the task ahead.